Good morning, Bookless Classroom. I have a lot on my mind today because today is April 22nd, and 5 years ago today, my husband passed away. So it's been 5 years, and I have, there has been a complete shroud of mystery around his death, around the death of Greg Newsom, Pam Newsom's husband, all part of Oakland County Sheriffs, and also Phil Rashid. So I don't know. All of the deaths, all of them a pretty big mystery. And so I try and continue to do what I am doing until the organized criminals who have been watching this whole thing and railroading good people more than just these last 5 years, for a very, very long time, all in, to me, identifying me as a person who would potentially bring down white supremacy. If you are able to calculate that using, technology, and the fact that there was just rampant racism in Fremont, Michigan, rampant racism. Yeah, I'm just really surprised so many years later that that was such a Christian town, supposedly such a Christian town, and but not a Catholic. So Catholics were really shunned, and you can hear that in some of the stories in our reading room, where we are reading Being Catholic Now in our reading room, and in our early birds, we are doing classes on, or talking about introspection. Shh, Lucy. And so looking at how do you take a look at your beliefs and your values and then kind of match those up against, Lucy, shh, the values of other religions and the beliefs of other religions. We talked about, I'm reading this, God is Red. This is a slow read for me. I have to take big breaks in this one because it takes a lot of thinking in between, and I usually put it down when there's something about it I don't like. And it doesn't mean I disagree with it. It might mean that it doesn't sit well with me, so I have to think about it more, or just that I have to think about it more. So God is Red by Vinay Deloria Jr. Okay, so and I have getting these questions about, a lot of times all my life, about who I am, right? So like, what am I as far as nationality goes? And honestly, I would say I probably am Italian, Mexican, and Ukrainian. It seems to make sense. I've heard all kinds of stories about all kinds of things, but that seems to make sense to me, right? And I like that. I like those roots. It does seem to me to be able to wrap your arms around 3 different ways of thinking, in a way, right? Mexican is very different than Italian. Italian certainly does have the organized criminal element to it. And the Ukraine also has that white supremacist aspect to it, but also that my family did speak Ukrainian in the house. So my grandmother was Ukrainian. And, you know, I don't know. There are some ways that are for everybody that become religious ways and religious beliefs that are you know, certainly from a Christian perspective, I don't know. It's just like the things here. Shouldn't they be recognizable? Shouldn't you recognize these things as growing atrocities? Wouldn't you do that, right? And I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't seem that that is the way things are going. You know, and we were talking about Steven Pinker, and it's really interesting that he thinks that the world is getting less violent when it really just, when the atrocities, I mean, even if you just see the growing atrocities because of technology, the way that this book is laying that out, right, in such a technical kind of way. And yeah, and I remember at Wayne State that they read this book in our class, which was The World Since World War II. And there actually wasn't a lot of time spent on that. It really was a lot of time that was spent on World War I and World War II. So that I found to be really interesting in that class, but I loved it. You know, I loved what I learned. But, you know, I don't know. All of college seemed to be that way. Was it really on point, right? Or were they just really serving up their interpretation of that class? Like perception. Shouldn't perception be like, I see it one way, but take it another? But no, it was, I see, feel, touch, taste. Science. Jeez. You just leave a person wanting, don't you? Okay. I get it. And then you don't, right? Of course, when you take away all of my family specifically, mention that again. After 60 years of demonstrating that really, if you stand by your American way, this shouldn't be happening. And that's all that's to that. Chapter 14, The Last Offensive and the Collapse of Empires. So if we remember what we were talking about back on the maps page was the takeover of those empires, right? So you're going to have to just give me just 1 second and I'll get that map up because I still have that up. I just don't have it in the right space. Okay. We were doing cursive in our early birds, but we were also doing introspection. Okay, so here we have got, let's pull that over here. We were remembering imperialism, right? And so some of these were cast Austria-Hungary Empire, German Empire, right? So cast as empires. And so now we see, and the collapse of empires. No, you don't see it. Now you see the collapse of empires, right? Okay, so here we have French civilians sit in the rubble beside the road as American troops pass through Saint Basant during the march to Saint Mihiel, September 13th, 1918. And I have to say too, there has been, just sort of as a culture here in Michigan anyway, sort of disparaging the French. And really, what a shame, right? Because they really were, well, it almost became a fashion show, didn't it? War. But it was a harmless fashion show. And then it became a harmful fashion show, right? And then there was death and destruction beyond what people could have imagined or imagined at all. Once again, a German offensive had been halted just outside the gates of Paris. Reinforced now by battle-ready American troops, the Allies mounted a massive counterattack. There was little the exhausted Germans could do but order a retreat, and by August 1918, they had been driven back to the Aisne River. To the north, German armies were retreating along the old Somme battlefield, abandoning land they had captured when starting their last-ditch offensive earlier that year. Until now, American troops had been fighting as part of the French and British armies. In September, General Pershing took command of the U.S. First Army and launched the war's first major independent American offensive. The objective was a large concentration of German troops around the town of Saint Mihiel, south of Verdun. The sky over the battlefield, both before and after dawn, aflame with exploding shells, star signals, burning supply dumps, and villages, presented a scene at once picturesque and terrible, Pershing wrote. The exultation in our minds that here at last, after 17 months of effort, an American army was fighting under its own flag was tempered by the realization of the sacrifice of life on both sides. The Germans were caught by surprise as 200,000 American troops, backed by 48,000 French, attacked in drizzling rain and mist along a 12-mile front. American tanks do not surrender as long as one tank is able to go forward, Lieutenant Colonel George Patton Jr. instructed his men. The attack was supported by the greatest air assault of the war. Nearly 1,500 planes saw action in the skies above the battlefield, strafing German trenches, and dropped bombs on the retreating enemy. Within 48 hours, the Americans had taken Saint Mihiel, captured 13,000 prisoners, and driven the Germans from positions they had held for 4 years. As swift and neat an operation as any in the war, reported the Manchester Guardian, a leading British newspaper. It was a victory won at a cost of more than 4,000 American lives. From Saint Mihiel, the U.S. Army moved north of Verdun to an area between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, where the Americans joined the final Allied offensive of World War I. The Meuse-Argonne campaign would be the war's biggest American battle. Its objective was to capture the critical railroad hub at the city of Sedan, which would break the rail network supporting the German army in France and Belgium. Fighting again, it just really, there's so much of a realization of the strategy in maligning people, right? Railroading people is those are the words that I use. Just so much strategy in it. And it is really scary because I see so much strategy in what is going on here by this right-winged, really, again, doesn't look as organized as it once was, but that doesn't mean that they're not ready to reorganize, not just demonstrating that there's, white trash right behind white trash. And if you're not white trash, it's just exactly like what you asked the Muslims to do after 9/11. You asked them, stand up, speak out, right? If this isn't what you believe in, what it appears to be, then you need to speak out. But people who were speaking out, what happens to them? I mean, I don't know. From what I understand, what's his name is living in Russia. I forgot his name, and I'm trying to think of it. And I really, But, not a lot of people appreciated that guy. But, that's because not a lot of people appreciate somebody who's in law enforcement, somebody who's willing to go against the grain for justice. Organized crime it's not surprising that it's in our military, that it's in our law enforcement, that it's in our justice system. And it is scary. It's scary for everybody. I mean, I know that there are probably a lot of people who think it's not scary for me. Because why? Because I'm being, wow, big deal. She got moved into an apartment. I keep things nice. The things that are ruined or that I don't have, it's not because of me, it's because of thieves. And that's organized crime. I don't know why people have to, what? I do think I know. Promoting who they want to promote and the agenda that they want to promote. And it is really beginning to be a question about who do you think is driving this ship? Fighting against stiff German resistance lasted for 6 weeks, from September 26th to November 11th, 1918. That's my sister's birthday, and that's also Veterans Day. The Meuse River, wide and deep, followed a twisting course between high cliffs from which German gunners could fire down on the Americans and the French forces on their left flank. The forest itself, 10 miles across, was a tangled thicket of trees and thorny underbush, honeycombed with German tunnels, concrete dugouts, and machine gun nests that the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying. On arriving at our new positions in the Argonne Forest, we found out that the fighting at this point must have been terrific, recalled Private McGuire, an American artilleryman. Thousands of trees were splintered, crushed down into the mud, and it made it hard for us to travel. We got our guns into position quickly because the amount of shelling that was done by the Germans had every man of us scared. Early in the battle, exactly. So, even those people here who are, so we got our guns into position quickly because the amount of shelling that was done by the Germans had every man of us scared. It is just, who could keep people the most afraid? Well, if you have artillery, you could keep the people, who most afraid. It's like in this book I'm reading, again, God is Red, who made them the enemy? It is so profound what I was just reading about wilderness, and that the concept of taming the wild is not a concept of the Native Americans. So they don't even see this as wild. They wouldn't, and you know, it's disgraceful. It's disgraceful how we have just built, and the contractors continue to build, and they continue to build, and they continue to build in favor of science and technology. And what? And a name in the history books. It's also interesting, which we've talked about in our Catholic school. One of the things that I am realizing is that there are things that, as far as women's issues, progressing women's issues went, we talked about those, but not so much women's issues as much as the issues of those who were impoverished, who were maligned, subjugated. That's a Catholic word I haven't brought up in a long time. That was a word we used a lot, right? Women were subjugated, but not as much as the poor, the Native Americans. And so this concept of wilderness, I need to get a drink of water. It's whatever. Came on with the West. And then the other thing is that we discussed at St. Michael's in Brunswick, Michigan, was that then these concepts with the books and with progress, these concepts became more ingrained simply because they were spoken, right? So India didn't have a history until they were conquered by England, for example, right? Oh, good stuff. That is for sure. Let me get a glass of water, but I'm gonna just quickly bring something up. Okay. So this was our early birds class, but we didn't talk about this actually in our early birds class, but that's not what I wanted to bring up. This is what I want to bring up. This is really an amazing, borrow that again, topic that I was on right there. Oh. Well, you can see right here some of the questions that are coming up. Right there. That's exactly what it's talking about. So you can look at that. And I am going to You know, the thing here is, where did I put my purse? There it is. There are just plenty of mischaracterizations to go around. It just, and the thing to me is if you want to find out who's mostly responsible for mischaracterizations, you would have to go to places like Universal Studios, Paramount Pictures, which is what I said has been going around here. A lot of paid actors is what is going on here, and I'm not one of them. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, people have maneuvered things and that I don't have to live and that I am doing a lot of work where the money and the work are not coinciding necessarily, right? But this is the work I do, nothing illegal. And that's what I started to say, is that this is, so there are just plenty of mischaracterizations going on. And if I were to, you know, say who's responsible for mischaracterizations, again, I would have to say the media. The media is responsible for that. They want to, making a big buck. Who's responsible for capitalism being so like, that would be the media, because most people are not benefiting from this system. And most people, I think, have common sense enough to know that all people can't benefit from a capitalistic system because it isn't the same as the Protestant work ethic, right? You try to make those one and the same, and they're not. They're simply not. And so we've got a bunch of, as I've said more than one time, a bunch of so-called Christians abandoning ship. They were really never Christians to begin with, right? And getting on board with what? Who they were always on board with in the first place? Scientists, right? It's not that I'm not on board with science. It's, as I've said many times, I'm not on board with a lot of scientists, right? Because what they do is they put progress of the mind before progress of anything else. And that's not the way the heart is. Progress of the heart is more important, right? Relationships, those kinds of things are more important. And it's just, again, the narrative that people have to put out there. If it's so goddamn apparent, then why is it so difficult for you? If it's so goddamn apparent that you are supreme, why is it so difficult for you? Whomever. On arriving at our new positions in the Argonne Forest, we found out that the fighting at this point must have been terrific, recalled Private McGuire, an American artilleryman, which I've read. Thousands of trees were splintered, crushed down in the mud, and it made it hard for us to travel. We got our guns into position quickly because the amount of shelling that was done by Germans had every man of us scared. Early in the all right, let's look at the picture. American doughboys rolled toward the Argonne Forest in French Renault 6-ton tanks, September 26, 1918. I have never understood that expression. I mean, as applicable to military people. Early in the battle, Major Charles Whittlesey of the U.S. 77th Division and more than 500 men trapped in a ravine behind enemy lines were surrounded by a much larger force of Germans. For 2 days, the Americans fought off the enemy troops. On the second day, their food ran out. Then they were hit by an American artillery barrage intended for the Germans. Private Omer Richards had carried into battle a cage holding 8 carrier pigeons, birds trained to carry messages between specific locations. Several birds dispatched with messages asking for help had been shot down. By now, there was just one bird left, a favorite named Cher Ami, French for dear friend. Richards clipped a message to the pigeon's left leg, giving the Americans location. We are along the road parallel to map reference 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sakes, stop it. Cher-Ami flew off through a blizzard of enemy bullets and exploding shells. The bird reached his loft 25 miles to the rear just 25 minutes later. He had been shot through the breast and blinded in one eye, but he had delivered the message clipped to his leg, which also had been hit by a bullet and was dangling by a tendon. The shelling was immediately halted. Nothing else was heard from the beleaguered Americans, who had become known to the world as the Lost Battalion. In an effort to rescue them, 2 divisions moved out toward the German lines, and as they approached, the Germans withdrew. On October 7th, after a 5-day siege, the 194 survivors of the Lost Battalion's 554 men climbed out of their ravine and marched back to the American lines. Cher-Ami lost his shattered leg, but army medics carved a small wooden leg for him. The French awarded the doughty little pigeon their Croix de Guerre medal for bravery under fire. Oh dear gosh. And my husband spoke French, and I heard my son speak French. Croix de Guerre medal for bravery under fire, and he was sent to the United States to become an army mascot. 4 African American infantry regiments, and then by comparison, right? Right? By comparison, seriously. The way we treat some humans who are soldiers in a battle. Here, top. African American combat troops stand on parade in France, 1918. They were equipped by and fought with the French. They were equipped by and fought with the French in 1918. Four African American infantry regiments. The U.S. Army was strictly segregated by race. Saw heavy fighting during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Each all-black regiment was equipped by and served with the French division. The 369th, popularly known as the Harlem Hellfighters, fought with the French at Chateau Thierry and Belleau-Wood, spending 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit. Corporal Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts became the first Americans to receive the French Croix de Guerre, and when the 369th captured the important village of Secault, the entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre. Which is a cross, right? That's a... Listen, I'm trying to get through these words. You all know I read it for the first time. Although I did hear it, I understand. Do not. I actually remember trying to get these words right because I knew I wanted to read this. It's like I remember preparing for the classroom, knowing that. But everything I wanted to do, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to start the classroom. I didn't have enough education. And I wanted to read this. I remember, but I also, I didn't have the education. So now I'm doing it. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was part of a larger Allied offensive taking place all along the Western Front as German armies fell back to the Hindenburg Line, their last line of resistance. Battlefields from which the Allies had been driven earlier in the war were now swiftly overrun. And this is what I'm talking about too, about just this crossover in the language where we've got the Hindenburg. Well, the Hindenburg to me is that the hydroplane. Wasn't that what those, I'm not getting the right, the big blimp, those blimps, right? I know. And then we got blimps and doughboys. What? Mixing up the language. It gets so confusing. Well, you know, that's what happened at the Tower of Babel, from what I understand, from what I've read. Let's see. The Germans no longer had the manpower to make up for their losses, while more and more Allied divisions were moving up to the front lines. This relentless push by British, French, Belgian, and American armies fighting side by side finally broke the spirit of the German army and ended its willingness to continue a hopeless fight. Now, this is interesting as well, right? So here you have got a spiritless, atheistic, mechanistic, like a machine moving through the world, right? Their spirit was easily broken. And all my life, that's what people have been trying to do. Break my spirit. What? I mean, WTF. Honest to gosh. Why always with the breaking of my spirit? Oh, for science. I know, because Christians did some, I know, we all talk about science. Like they're the ones who figured out those contraptions for torture, then say, hey, Pope, look at the picture I have. Use this on Barnabas. On September 28th, we got to get to the pictures. So here, we already had the top, the African American combat troops stand on parade in France. This must be before the war. On the bottom, members of the, because it does say they were equipped by and fought with the French. Because a lot of times people, again, Americans were segregated by race. And if you saw the movie Glory, in that movie, they would not let the blacks fight, right? In that movie, but finally they did, right? And then it was like, again, they were just like coming nonstop. It was, right? And they were in the valley there, so they were just sitting ducks. Horrible, 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 horrible scene in that movie. And, and that's also, so media has got a bad rap because some people are perverting media and changing it instead of giving you, something authentic. Like, I'm a teacher. Bottom, members of the all-black 369th Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. The entire regiment was awarded France's Croix de Guerre Medal for gallantry in action. Is that crew? I think it's Kerry. And then in this picture, an American machine gun crew battles in the Argonne forest. Well, that's one way to fight, right? Right here. On September 28th, General Ludendorff informed Kaiser Wilhelm that there was now no prospect of winning the war. The German army had been crippled by a sense of looming defeat. Ludendorff said, because of the sheer number of Americans arriving daily at the front. To avert a catastrophe, Ludendorff told the Kaiser, Germany must seek an immediate armistice. Still, the war continued. More than 1 million American soldiers were now fighting in the Argonne. Despite setbacks and heavy casualties, the Americans finally broke through the German defenses, and by the end of October, they had cleared the forest of enemy troops. The roads and fields were strewn with dead Germans, horses, masses of artillery, transport, ammunition limbers, helmets, guns, and bayonets. Private Rush Young recalled. Early in November, the U.S. 1st Division reached the hills overlooking Sedan, then moved aside to allow the French army the honor of capturing the city, the site of a French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. French, British, and Belgian armies, meanwhile, were assaulting German defenses along the rest of the Western Front. The morale of the troops has suffered seriously, a German general reported, and their power of resistance diminishes daily. They surrender in hordes whenever the enemy attacks. Whatever happens, we must make peace before the enemy break through into Germany. That's plural. It just really does sound like this is Germany against the rest of the world. I don't know. And they made soldiers out of these men in that there was nothing that they would not accept defeat. Right? So this German mentality, they would not accept defeat. And it's, you just have to frame it differently, Germans. It's not defeat, it's assimilation into a healthy, different lifestyle. It is, again, with that quote from God is Red, which I'll find for tomorrow, probably, I hope, about that it's not even a concept of wilderness to them, right? The wild. And I remember having that conversation a long time ago. When I was little. I just think that there were people around who just didn't understand the power of thinking beyond what was right in your vicinity, and that is very scary for people, right? I don't know. But I just remember that it was like saying these things that coincide with this, including God is red. We all know what that means. He's pissed as hell, being misrepresented all over the place, and now as if humans are God. I don't know. And perverting the language. And then that media piece. Oh, the humanity. With that blimp, the Hindenburg. So it's like a whitewash, which really gives, fear and doubt to people, for sure. It is a recipe for fear and doubt. And that really is, it is, again, I'm using the new word, deplorable. Still, the war continued. More than 1 million American soldiers were now fighting in the Argonne. Wow. 1 million American soldiers. Despite setbacks and heavy casualties, the Americans finally broke through the German defenses, and by the end of October, they had cleared the forest of enemy troops. The roads and fields were strewn with dead Germans. I already read this. Horses, masses of artillery transport, ammunition, limbers, helmets, guns, and bayonets, Private Rush Young recalled. Early in November, the U.S. 1st Division reached the hills overlooking Sedan, then moved aside to allow the French army the honor of capturing the city, the site of a French defeat in Franco-Prussia War in 1870. French, British, and Belgian armies, meanwhile, were assaulting German defenses along the rest of the Western Front. The morale of the troops has suffered seriously, a German general reported, and their power of resistance diminishes daily. They surrender in hordes whenever the enemy attacks. Didn't I already read all this? I did. Whatever happens, we must make peace before the enemy break through into Germany. Behind the lines, this is where I was. Did we see German troops surrender to an advancing Allied force as it nears the Hindenburg Line? I know, I clearly have a lot on my mind. I'm just making a lot of associations right here with a lot of this stuff. I remember thinking, if you were to pan from the Hindenburg, would this be what it looks like? I'm just curious. Behind the lines, Germany was on the verge of chaos. At the end of October, German naval crews mutinied, and within a week, revolutionary outbreaks had spread to every big German city. On November 9th, the generals, fearing the kind of full-fledged revolution that had occurred in Russia, informed Kaiser Wilhelm that he no longer commanded the confidence of the army. The Kaiser must abdicate, otherwise we shall have the revolution, he was told. Your abdication has become necessary to save Germany from civil war. Wilhelm fled across the Dutch border to take refuge in neutral Holland, where he signed his formal abdication as King of Prussia and German Emperor. Germany was declared a republic. In Berlin, a delegation was formed to meet with Allied war leaders and ask for surrender terms. Germany's partners among the Central Powers had already sued for peace. Bulgaria, deprived of German and Austrian support, was the first to surrender to allies, signing an armistice agreement on September 29th. Turkey capitulated a month later on October 30th. In the Middle East, the Turks had suffered a series of defeats by the British, who captured Baghdad in March 1917 and Palestine in September 1918. With Turkey's collapse, the 7-century-old Turkish Ottoman Empire vanished into history. Austria-Hungary threatened with the complete breakdown of order as people in the cities starved and rioted, signed an armistice agreement on November 3rd. The Austrian army had been routed when the Italians, heavily reinforced by British and French divisions, finally went on the offensive. Austrian troops, ragged and hungry, deserted by the thousands. Austria-Hungary would be split up into several smaller nations, putting an end to the Habsburg Empire. On November 7th, with Berlin and other German cities in turmoil and Kaiser Wilhelm about to abdicate, a German delegation crossed the front line under a flag of truce to meet with Marshal Ferdinand Foch, commander-in-chief of the Allied armies, in his railroad carriage in the forest of Compiègne. north of Paris. Germany had not actually surrendered, but had asked for an armistice, a ceasefire, to discuss possible peace terms. An armistice would end the fighting, but not necessarily the war. In theory, it would have been possible for the Germans to refuse the Allied terms and continue the battle. The armistice terms presented by Marshal Foch was designed to make sure that the Germans would have no further power to resist. All occupied territories in France and Belgium were to be evacuated immediately, and all territory conquered in Eastern Europe since 1914, including lands ceded by Russia at Brest-Litovsk. What is that? Was to be surrendered. Massive quantities of weapons and other military equipment, including most of the German Navy and all German submarines, were to be handed over to the Allies. Allied forces would temporarily occupy a band of German territory along the Rhine River, and Germany would be required to pay reparations or damages for the loss and destruction caused by the war. Finally, the Allied blockade of German ports would continue until a peace treaty was signed. The Germans protested that the terms were too harsh, that the continuing blockade would lead to famine and anarchy in Germany. Foch was unmoved. The Germans had no alternatives but to sign. On November 11th, 1918, shortly after 5 a.m., the two sides signed an armistice agreement that would go into effect at 11 that morning. At 2 minutes before 11, as millions of soldiers on the Western Front waited for the hostilities to end, a Canadian soldier, Private George Price, was killed by a German sniper's bullet at the French village of Villiers-sur-Haine. Then it was over. On November 11th at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent on the Western Front. Yeah, that's November 11th is my sister's birthday, Veterans Day. Isn't that interesting? So Veterans Day is like, I mean, I don't know. American troops at the front hoist a flag and celebrate after the last shot had been fired, November 11th, 1918. So is that when Veterans Day, why Veterans Day is on that date? And isn't that interesting? November 11th at 11 a.m., the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. It's interesting. Doesn't it seem like the poetry is there then in motion? So to go into effect at 11 that morning, why not 5? Why not as soon as they signed it? Marshal Ferdinand Foch, second from right, stands outside his railroad carriage after signing the armistice agreement. Second from the right. So there we go. So this dude. Okay, so that's all we're going to read for today. It's 11:21 and we're supposed to be in the reading room at 11:30. It's going to take us a little bit longer than that. As you can see, I started a little bit late here as well because we ran a little bit late in Early Birds. So we're coming back on chapter 15, which is called Losing the Peace. Losing the Peace. Oh, this really does. It's so interesting to me too, because again, having this read and then, like I said, deciding to want to read this in my classroom because I just felt like things were going to go online, right? And was that? I'm not sure if that was after September 11th or not. I'm not sure. I would have to take a look at. I know I started in 1998 at Wayne State. That's when I started. Or 99 or something like that. It took me a long time. Sorry, guys. I always say 2000 because that's, I don't know. Well, no, because, well, yeah. No, undergraduate. I'm not sure. I graduated in May 2010. That's what my diploma says. That's what my PhD says. And that's why I call myself Dr. Annette Feravich. We'll be back here and it's going to probably take me 20 minutes. It usually does. Take me about 20 minutes to get back here. And we are reading. No, that's what I'm reading. We together here are reading Being Catholic Now. See how I do that? So I get this read in front of you guys, and then I get to read myself another book. Oh, it is good. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you so much for joining me here in the classroom. I will be back in about 20.